Comrades, do you know the truth behind the gilded walls that surround the palaces of the rich? Do you understand how, while your hands bleed, while your minds labour under endless toil, the few grow fat and secure upon the very sweat that drips from your brow? Open your eyes, for the world you believe is fair is nothing but a stage where the ruling class performs a deception so complete that it masks chains with gold and oppression with the illusion of freedom. The rich remain rich not by genius, nor by virtue, nor by labour of their own, but by the relentless exploitation of yours. They command the means of production, the factories, the lands, the machinery, the knowledge that shapes every industry, and in doing so, they command your very lives. Every hour you labour, every skill you offer, every drop of strength you surrender, enriches a few while leaving the many to scrape for survival. The system tells you that your reward is fair, that your wage is your freedom, but in truth, this wage is a fraction, a calculated morsel designed to maintain dependence and obedience. Observe closely, comrades, under the cloak of legality, under the guise of contracts and commerce, your labour is alienated. You are separated from the product of your work. It belongs not to you, but to the capitalist who sells it for profit. You are alienated from yourselves, reduced to a mere instrument of production, and alienated from each other, pitted against your brothers and sisters in a competition that serves their wealth. Your energies, your intelligence, your very humanity are harnessed to build fortunes that you will never taste, houses that you cannot live in, and power that you cannot wield. How do they maintain this dominance? Not solely through the extraction of labour, but through the shaping of consciousness. They infiltrate your minds with the ideology that justifies their wealth and your servitude. They tell you to admire wealth as a symbol of merit, to accept hierarchy as natural, to compete rather than unite. They make you complicit in your own oppression, turning survival into aspiration, and aspiration into acquiescence. Education, media, culture, even morality itself, is weaponized to obscure the class struggle that surrounds you, to make invisible the chains that bind. But history, comrades, is not blind to justice. It is written by struggle, not by those who sit comfortably upon the labour of others. The power of the few depends entirely on the submission of the many. And the moment the workers awaken, organize, and act in collective solidarity, the foundations of this system quake. For what is wealth but accumulated labour stolen from those who create it? What is power but control over the labour of others? Strip the capitalist of the monopoly over the means of production, and the illusion of inevitability collapses. We must see clearly the path to liberation is not passive acceptance, not timid reform, but conscious, organized struggle. Unite across industries, across borders, across trades, for your chains are interconnected. Understand that the exploitation you endure is systemic, and that no individual act of kindness from the wealthy will restore your dignity. The machines, the lands, the markets, the instruments of labour all must be reclaimed for the people. Only through collective ownership, only through democratic control of production, can the fruits of labour belong to those who toil. Rise, comrades, for the hour of awakening is upon us. Denounce the ideology that masks oppression as opportunity. Reject the divisions that weaken your collective strength. Teach, organize, and resist, for the wealth of society has been amassed through your sacrifice, and it is yours by right. The struggle is not distant, it is here, in the factories, in the fields, in the offices, in the streets. The world you build must be one where labour is not a tool of domination but the foundation of freedom. The rich fear your unity more than any storm, more than any weapon. They tremble before the organized, conscious, determined working class. Understand, comrades, that the wealth of the few is inseparable from the exploitation of the many, and the moment the many claim what is rightfully theirs, the era of injustice will crumble. Let us march, deliberate and fearless, toward a society where the fruits of labour enrich all, not the privileged few. Let us transform our suffering into power, our work into liberation, and our unity into revolution. The fundamental mechanism by which the ruling class sustains its wealth is the systematic extraction of labour from the working class. Every product that adorns the markets, every commodity that circulates through society, every technological advancement and material convenience bears the imprint of labour, yet the worker who creates it receives only a fraction of its value. This fraction, this wage, is presented as a fair exchange, a legitimate reward for work, but in reality it is a carefully calculated instrument of exploitation. The capitalist does not compensate labour according to its true value. Instead, the value created by the labourer exceeds the wages paid, and it is this surplus, this unpaid labour, that is converted into profit, into accumulation, and into the power that sustains the wealthy elite. The more the worker labours, the more the capitalist profits, and the worker, as own sustenance, remains constrained, never reflecting the full magnitude of the effort they expend. This system of exploitation is not an accident, nor a consequence of human weakness. It is an inherent feature of capitalist society. From the moment the worker sells their labour, they enter into a relationship defined not by mutual benefit, but by extraction and subordination. The tools, the raw materials, the spaces of production all remain under the ownership of the capitalist, so that the labourer can only offer themselves as a commodity. They are not the master of their work, they are the instrument through which wealth is generated for another. Each hour spent bending over a machine, lifting, calculating, designing, or crafting, becomes a moment in which personal vitality is appropriated, transformed into capital that enriches a class that does not labour. To labour under such conditions is to witness the transformation of effort into power that one does not possess, to see one's productivity serve ends entirely outside one's control. Moreover, the intensity of this exploitation increases with technological and organizational advancements. Machinery that could reduce toil instead often becomes a mechanism for extracting greater surplus value. Efficiency is not introduced to free the worker from labor, but to intensify it, to produce more in the same span of time, to squeeze additional value from human effort while leaving the worker's remuneration largely unchanged. The introduction of speed. Measurement and control in production is presented as progress, but in reality it magnifies the extraction of labour, converting hours, energy and skill into profit, leaving the worker exhausted and materially no richer than before. Labour is transformed into a commodity to be bought and sold, yet the price of this commodity is always suppressed, always lower than the value produced, always reinforcing the wealth of those who do not labour. The capitalist relationship also breeds dependency. Wages are designed not only to compensate but to bind. They are sufficient to maintain life, but insufficient to allow freedom from labour. Workers must sell their labour day after day, week after week, year after year, because survival depends upon it. This dependence ensures compliance and discourages resistance, for the worker cannot afford to refuse labour, even when it is exploitative, even when it is dehumanizing. The worker as time, the worker as energy, the worker as health all become resources mined for the enrichment of the few. Society applauds this system as efficient or rational. Yet it is built upon a profound injustice. The wealth of one class is inseparable from the deprivation of another. Exploitation is not limited to physical labour, but extends to intellectual and creative labour as well. The engineer, the designer, the thinker, the planner all labour to generate ideas, innovations, and strategies that expand capital, yet their compensation rarely approaches the value they produce. Their creativity is harnessed, their intellect appropriated, and the surplus value they create flows into the coffers of ownership, rather than returning to those who conceived and executed it. Even when labour appears highly skilled or specialized, the underlying principle remains the same. The worker produces more than they receive, and the difference, the unpaid labour, is the foundation of wealth accumulation. Furthermore, exploitation under capitalism is normalized, naturalized, and rendered invisible. Laws, contracts, and institutions give the appearance of fairness while codifying the extraction of surplus value. Workers are led to believe that wages are the entirety of their worth, that the profit of the capitalist is earned honestly, and that resistance is futile or selfish. Ideology conceals the true relationship. That the wealth of the rich is built directly upon the labor of those who work harder than they ever rest, who contribute more than they ever receive, and whose value to society is measured by what can be taken from them, not by the fruits of their effort. Under capitalism, the worker is not merely exploited for their labor, they are alienated from the very essence of their activity, their creativity, and their fellow human beings. Labor, which in a just society would be an expression of one's own capacities, a manifestation of intellect and skill, becomes under the capitalist system a mechanism of estrangement. The product of labor is no longer the worker's own. It is appropriated by the capitalist, transformed into an object whose purpose is to generate profit rather than fulfill human need. A worker may spend hours crafting a good, constructing a machine, or assembling a product, yet the outcome of this effort is claimed entirely by another, sold for gain, and exists independently of the laborer who created it. The worker experiences their own creativity as something external, as something that belongs to someone else, and in this their work ceases to be an extension of their humanity and becomes an instrument of domination. This separation is not merely material but profoundly psychological. The act of labor, when stripped of its autonomy and directed toward the profit of another, ceases to nourish the spirit, and instead becomes a form of self-alienation. The worker cannot see themselves in the products they produce, cannot identify with their work, and is denied the satisfaction of realizing their own capacities. Each action, each skillful movement, each intellectual effort is transformed into a means for enriching another, leaving the laborer with the bitter knowledge that their energy and talent serve ends entirely beyond their control. Work, instead of cultivating the worker's mind and body, fragments their identity, turning creativity and skill into commodities, and the worker into a mere appendage of production. The worker becomes estranged from their own life, from their potential, and from the very essence of being human, as the act that should be self-affirming instead becomes a daily surrender of autonomy. The alienation extends beyond the individual to the social sphere. Capitalism enforces competition between workers, fostering isolation, distrust, and division. Those who share the same plight, who are bound by similar toil, struggle, and suffering are made rivals, pitted against one another for jobs, wages, and favor. Solidarity, the natural bond that should arise from shared labor, is undermined by the mechanisms of wage labor and the ideology of individual advancement. Social relations are mediated not by community or cooperation but by contracts, money, and hierarchy, and the worker finds themselves separated from their fellow human beings, unable to form the genuine, unalienated relationships that would be possible in a society where labor serves human need rather than profit. In this enforced isolation, the worker experiences loneliness even in crowds, estrangement even among peers, and the recognition that the bonds of humanity have been subverted by a system that turns people into instruments for the accumulation of capital. Alienation also manifests in the worker as relation to the act of labor itself. The work is compelled, imposed, and dictated by the needs of capital rather than chosen freely. The worker is directed by rules, quotas, and managerial authority, reducing complex human effort to repetitive, monotonous tasks. Each repetition, each mechanical action, each requirement imposed by the employer is a reminder that the worker has no mastery over their labor. Their activity is external to themselves, coercive rather than voluntary, and their human capacities are objectified and subordinated to the abstract imperative of profit. The worker labors not for self-realization, not for expression, not for the satisfaction of need, but to fulfill the demands of a system that measures worth in output, efficiency, and surplus value. In this, the act of labor, which should empower and fulfill, becomes a source of estrangement and suffering. The consequences of this alienation are far-reaching. It erodes dignity, diminishes self-worth, and engenders a sense of powerlessness. Workers come to perceive themselves as instruments, their lives measured in hours sold, energy expended, and productivity extracted. Even when material needs are met, the spiritual and psychological toll of alienation remains, for the worker experiences life as something external, imposed, and alien. Creativity, intelligence, and labor are separated from their possessor. Wealth is appropriated by another, and human potential is confined to the service of profit. The worker's true humanity, capable of creation, cooperation, and fulfillment, is subordinated to the machinery of exploitation, leaving society impoverished not only in material justice, but in the richness of human life itself. Alienation is thus a structural feature of capitalist production, inseparable from the logic of private property and wage labor. It is through this alienation that the system perpetuates both exploitation and the illusion of legitimacy, concealing the profound injustice by presenting labor as natural, inevitable, and individualized. To overcome alienation is to reclaim one's work, one's relationships, and one's humanity, to transform labor from an instrument of oppression into an expression of freedom, and to unite with fellow workers in solidarity against the structures that enforce estrangement. The power of the ruling class is not maintained solely through force or wealth. It is upheld most insidiously through the control of ideas, beliefs, and consciousness. Capitalism does not merely extract labor, it shapes thought, molds perception, and teaches the oppressed to accept their own subjugation as natural, inevitable, and deserved. The ideology of the powerful permeates every institution, every cultural narrative, every law, and every custom, presenting a vision of society in which inequality is normalized and hierarchy is celebrated. The worker, taught to admire wealth and respect authority, comes to internalize the very structures that exploit them, seeing the accumulation of property and privilege as merit rather than theft. In this way, consciousness itself becomes a terrain of domination, and the imagination of freedom is constrained by a worldview imposed from above. Through education, media, religion, and culture, the ruling class instills the belief that society functions according to fairness, merit, and natural order. The worker is told that their station is the product of personal effort, moral character, or talent, while the wealth of the few is depicted as the fruit of intelligence, diligence, or superior ability. Competition is exalted as virtuous, pitting worker against worker, individual against individual, in a contest where the rules are designed to favor those who already control resources. In this way, society's inequalities are obscured as the natural consequence of human differences rather than the systematic product of exploitation. Workers come to police themselves, judging themselves and each other by standards established to protect the wealth and power of the ruling class. The ideology of competition masks collective exploitation, and the divisions it creates among the oppressed prevent the development of solidarity that could challenge the status quo. The institutions of law, property, and governance reinforce this ideology, giving it the appearance of legitimacy and inevitability. Private property is presented as sacred, as the foundation of freedom, when in fact it is the instrument of oppression. The right to own the means of production ensures the continued extraction of surplus value from labor, yet it is celebrated as the moral underpinning of society. The worker is taught to respect this right, even as it chains them to a system that denies the fruits of their own labor. Laws are written and enforced not to guarantee justice for all, but to stabilize the conditions of domination, making exploitation appear lawful, rational, and proper. By internalizing these rules and norms, workers participate in their own subjugation, believing that the structures which bind them are expressions of fairness, order, and progress. Religion and culture serve similar functions, presenting suffering, deprivation, and inequality as natural, virtuous, or temporary. Workers are encouraged to look beyond material injustice, to seek consolation in faith, hope, or the promise of future reward, rather than to confront the systemic mechanisms that perpetuate their oppression. Cultural narratives glorify individual achievement while obscuring collective labor, telling stories of self-made success while hiding the labor and exploitation that underpin every fortune. Art, literature, and popular media are co-opted to reinforce these lessons, shaping desires, aspirations, and expectations so that the imagination of alternative social arrangements becomes faint, distant, and suspect. Through ideology, the workers' perception is constrained, their rebellion deferred, and their energies diverted into pursuits that strengthen rather than challenge the capitalist order. Competition, the division of labor, and the cultivation of envy among workers are deliberate tools of control. By convincing workers that they are rivals rather than allies, the ruling class prevents the formation of collective consciousness, the awareness of shared exploitation, and the organization necessary to reclaim power. Workers are made to believe that advancement depends on individual cunning or exceptionalism rather than unity and solidarity. The ideology of meritocracy masks structural oppression, transforming social hierarchies into a moral narrative in which the victim accepts blame and the oppressor enjoys consent. In this way, consciousness itself is structured to sustain domination, inequality is naturalized, exploitation is justified, and rebellion is rendered improbable. Yet ideology is not invincible, it exists only as long as it is unexamined, only as long as workers fail to perceive the systemic mechanisms of their subjugation. Consciousness can be transformed, and with transformation comes the capacity for collective action. Once workers recognize that their beliefs, desires, and rivalries have been shaped to serve the few, once they see that the legitimacy of wealth is founded on theft rather than merit, the very apparatus of ideological control can be challenged. Education, dialogue, and solidarity become tools of emancipation, stripping away illusions, revealing the exploitation concealed by cultural norms, and awakening the working class to its true collective power. Ideology, in this sense, is the invisible chain, subtler than any whip, yet no less binding. It instructs the oppressed to accept exploitation, to compete against one another, and to see domination as natural, making the struggle for liberation not merely economic but intellectual and moral. To overthrow the capitalist order requires not only the seizure of material means, but the awakening of consciousness, the dismantling of ideas that justify inequality, and the recognition that power rests not in inevitability, but in the collective submission and obedience of those who labor. The path to liberation lies not in the isolated effort of one worker, nor in the quiet endurance of exploitation, but in the conscious unity of the many who labor. Capitalism thrives upon division, upon the scattering of energy, upon the belief that each worker is alone in their struggle. It is only by fragmenting the working class through competition, hierarchy, and manufactured rivalries that the ruling class can maintain dominance. Yet when workers recognize their common condition, when they see that the injustice they endure is shared by millions, the potential for collective power becomes immeasurable. Unity transforms vulnerability into strength, passivity into action, and scattered discontent into an organized force capable of reshaping society. To organize is not merely a practical necessity, it is a revolutionary imperative, the means by which the exploited reclaim control over their labor, their communities, and their lives. Workers. Unity begins with consciousness, with the recognition that the exploitation of one is the exploitation of all. Every wage withheld, every labor hour stolen, every instance of subjugation is part of a system that thrives upon the compliance of the many. When workers internalize this truth, they begin to see their fellow laborers not as competitors but as comrades, not as obstacles, but as allies in the struggle for emancipation. This shared awareness fosters solidarity, which is the foundation of all collective action. Without solidarity, strikes fail, protests collapse, and movements dissipate into ineffectual dissent. With solidarity, even the most entrenched structures of power can be challenged, for the strength of the few pales in comparison to the coordinated force of the many. Organization amplifies this unity, transforming shared understanding into strategic action. Individual acts of resistance, while courageous, are insufficient against a system so vast and entrenched. It is through deliberate coordination, through unions, councils, assemblies, and associations that workers harness their collective strength. Organization allows for the synchronization of labor, the collective refusal to submit to exploitation, and the assertion of demands that cannot be ignored. It provides the mechanisms by which grievances are communicated, strategies are formulated, and campaigns of resistance are executed. Without organization, consciousness remains a private insight, solidarity a sentiment, and potential power unrealized with it. The worker becomes part of an unstoppable social force capable of confronting wealth, dismantling oppression, and reclaiming control over the means of production. Collective action is the practical expression of this unity and organization. Strikes, demonstrations, occupations, and coordinated labor initiatives are the instruments through which workers assert their rights and challenge the legitimacy of the ruling class. Each act of resistance sends a message: the system is not immutable, the power of capital is not absolute, and the workers will not endure exploitation silently. Collective action creates leverage because the worker is the producer of society's wealth. When labor is withheld or redirected, the very machinery of profit grinds to a halt. The ruling class, accustomed to compliance, is forced to reckon with the power it has long taken for granted. Action, sustained and organized, transforms consciousness into reality, asserting that those who labor are not merely appendages of production, but the creators and owners of the society they sustain. Unity, organization, and action are mutually reinforcing. Awareness without organization produces moral indignation but little effect. Organization without consciousness risks becoming bureaucratic, mechanical, or easily co-opted. Action without solidarity collapses under pressure. Together, these elements form the triumvirate of liberation: understanding the injustice, structuring collective force, and executing deliberate intervention. Each worker, aware of their exploitation and linked to comrades, becomes a node in a network of resistance that is both resilient and formidable. When this network grows, the balance of power shifts. The illusion of capitalist inevitability is shattered, and the possibility of social transformation emerges not as a dream, but as an imminent, attainable reality. Collective power also nurtures confidence, courage, and imagination. As workers unite, they see that their labor is not inherently subordinate, that the wealth they produce can belong to them, and that the system that has oppressed them is not eternal. This realization transforms despair into determination, passivity into initiative, and isolation into solidarity. When workers act together, they create a space in which new forms of society, equitable, cooperative, and human-centered, can begin to take shape. The struggle becomes not only about defending immediate rights, but about constructing a world in which labor ceases to be a source of oppression and becomes instead a source of fulfillment, dignity, and shared prosperity. In every factory, field, and office, the seeds of this collective power exist. Each moment of cooperation, each act of mutual aid, each recognition of shared oppression strengthens the bonds of unity and the potential for organized action. It is through these bonds that workers begin to reclaim authority over their lives and the society they sustain. The power of the many, once awakened and harnessed, is greater than any fortress of wealth, any army of enforcement, any ideology designed to divide and subjugate. It is the ultimate instrument of social transformation, the true measure of human potential, and the path through which liberation becomes not an abstract ideal, but a lived, achievable reality. The liberation of the working class cannot be achieved through appeals to morality, concessions, or the benevolence of the ruling class. It requires the fundamental seizure of power, the reclamation of what has always belonged to those who labor. True freedom is inseparable from control over the means of production, the factories, the machinery, the land, the resources, and the knowledge through which society creates wealth. As long as these instruments remain in the hands of the few, the many remain bound to a system that extracts their labor, alienates their creativity, and enforces their dependence. To reclaim wealth and rights is not merely to demand fair wages or temporary relief. It is to transform the very foundations of economic and social life so that the fruits of human effort serve the collective rather than the privileged few. The wealth of society is not a gift from the rich. It is the product of millions of lives spent producing, creating, and sustaining life itself, and it is only just that those who labor should control its use. Seizing the means of production is both a material and a moral act. It recognizes that labor, not capital, generates value, that those who toil are the true authors of society's prosperity, and that private accumulation at the expense of collective effort is theft justified by ideology. When workers reclaim ownership of factories, lands, and resources, they reclaim dignity, autonomy, and agency over their own lives. Work ceases to be a forced necessity and becomes a deliberate, meaningful activity in service of human need rather than profit. This is not an abstract promise. It is a transformation of society from one organized around the enrichment of a few to one organized around the fulfillment, welfare, and development of all. It is the inversion of exploitation into empowerment, dependence into sovereignty, and alienation into creative participation. Redistribution of the fruits of labor is inseparable from control over production. Surplus value, which under capitalism is expropriated to feed wealth, luxury, and power, must instead be directed to those who generate it. Every hour of labor, every skill applied, every effort expended produces value that belongs to the worker. When wealth is equitably distributed, society ceases to be stratified by birth, property, or inheritance, and the productive contributions of each person are acknowledged, rewarded, and shared. Redistribution is not charity or indulgence, it is justice, the rectification of centuries of expropriation, and the recognition that society, as resources, exist to meet the needs of the people who sustain it. Housing, healthcare, education, and public goods are no longer privileges granted by benevolent elites, but rights guaranteed by collective ownership and democratic control. The reclamation of wealth and rights also transforms political and social relations. Power, once centralized in the hands of those who exploit labor, is decentralized and made accountable to those who produce society's wealth. Democracy in this context is not merely the casting of votes, but the direct participation of workers in decision-making over production, distribution, and the allocation of resources. Councils, assemblies, and cooperative structures replace hierarchical management designed to extract surplus value. The social bond becomes one of cooperation, solidarity, and mutual recognition rather than competition, hierarchy, and coercion. As workers reclaim control over their labor and its outcomes, they reclaim authority over the conditions of life itself, asserting that society exists not to enrich the few, but to empower the many. Reclaiming wealth and rights also entails the dismantling of the legal and ideological structures that have justified the expropriation of labor. Laws that enshrine private property, contracts that enforce subordination, and cultural norms that glorify accumulation must be challenged, exposed, and replaced with frameworks that reflect the collective interest. Education and consciousness-raising become essential tools, revealing the mechanisms through which labor has been exploited and guiding society toward forms of production and governance that are participatory, equitable, and human-centered. The process is revolutionary not only in its seizure of material assets, but in its transformation of thought, culture, and the social imagination. Ultimately reclaiming wealth and rights is the assertion of human dignity against a system that has denied it. It is the insistence that the laborer, not the capitalist, is the source of society's abundance, and that no human being should be reduced to a means for another's profit. By controlling the means of production and redistributing the fruits of labor, workers not only secure material justice but redefine freedom itself, freedom from exploitation, freedom from alienation, and freedom to create, cooperate, and flourish. This reclamation is the foundation for a society where wealth serves life rather than power, where labour becomes expression rather than coercion, and where human potential is realised collectively rather than expropriated privately. Comrades, the truth is undeniable. The wealth of the few rests upon the labour of the many, the power of the ruling class upon the submission of the oppressed, and the stability of the system upon the illusions that conceal exploitation. The chains that bind us are neither natural nor eternal. They are forged by human hands, and they can be broken by human will. Liberation does not come from patience, reform, or the grudging mercy of those who profit from our toil. It comes from our unity, our organization, our consciousness, and our action. When workers recognize their common cause, when laborers act together to seize control of the means of production, when the fruits of our work are reclaimed for those who create them, the foundations of oppression will tremble, and the era of injustice will end. We are the creators of the world, the producers of wealth, the architects of society itself. Let us refuse to labour for the enrichment of others while our own dignity is denied. Let us break the illusions that divide us, expose the ideologies that enslave us, and act in unbreakable solidarity. The power to reshape society, to abolish exploitation, to transform alienation into freedom, lies not in the hands of the wealthy but in our own. Let us rise, not as isolated individuals, but as a united force, conscious of our strength, determined in our purpose, and unyielding in our demand for justice. The time for awakening, for struggle, and for reclamation is now. The world we deserve, a world of equality, of shared wealth, of human dignity, awaits only the courage, unity, and action of those who labour.